In the middle of the 19th century, America was a country in flux, torn between tradition and progress, superstition and science. Kentucky, with its rolling hills and borderland identity, was a place where agricultural traditions sat beside new industrial ambitions, where old folk practices mingled uneasily with the rise of modern medicine. It was here in 1847 that whispers began to spread of a physician whose name became synonymous with both fascination and dread. Dr. Cornelius Sullivan, a man trained in the medical sciences of his day, established what would come to be called the Medical Institute of Horror, though at the time it bore a much more dignified name. His practices, his patients, and the legacy he left behind became a chilling reflection of how easily the boundaries of medicine could blur into the realm of cruelty, and how the pursuit of knowledge could leave behind a trail of human suffering. To understand Sullivan and his institute, it is important to remember the state of medicine in America at the time. In the 1840s, medical education was often haphazard, with physicians learning their trade in apprenticeships or by attending one of the many medical schools that had sprung up across the country. Kentucky itself was home to a number of these institutions, including the Transylvania University Medical Department in Lexington, which was one of the first significant medical schools west of the Allegheny Mountains. But education was far from standardized, and there were wide disagreements on what treatments worked, what counted as ethical, and how far a physician might go in the name of discovery. Anatomical knowledge was desperately sought after. Dissection of human bodies was considered essential for medical progress, yet it remained highly controversial, even illegal in many states. Grave robbing was common, and the trade in corpses became a shadow economy linked to medical schools and hospitals. It was against this backdrop that Sullivan's reputation began to form. Born in the early years of the 19th century, he reportedly studied in the Northeast before returning to Kentucky, where he established himself as both a practicing doctor and an ambitious researcher. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Sullivan seemed less interested in bedside manner or community respectability. His focus was on experimentation, on pushing past the boundaries that others respected. The institute he founded was not initially a large building or official hospital. It began as a modest establishment on the outskirts of a Kentucky town, advertised as a place of advanced medical study and treatment. Families in rural areas, desperate for cures to diseases that local doctors could not manage, were often willing to bring their sick relatives to Sullivan's care. But once inside his walls, patients sometimes never returned. Rumors began to circulate, of screams in the night, of strange smells wafting from his laboratory, of wagons arriving under cover of darkness. The mid-19th century was a time of devastating epidemics. Cholera outbreaks swept through Kentucky and neighboring states, while tuberculosis, typhoid fever, and malaria claimed countless lives. Physicians struggled with limited tools, and mortality rates were appallingly high. Some saw this as a justification for more aggressive experimentation, reasoning that desperate circumstances demanded desperate measures. Sullivan embraced this mindset with a fervor that set him apart. He began to perform procedures that were radical, even by the standards of the 1840s. Accounts describe surgeries without anesthesia, long before chloroform became common. He dissected bodies in pursuit of understanding, not only of disease, but of what he called the thresholds of human endurance. This phrase would later become infamous in descriptions of his work. For Sullivan, medicine was not simply about curing disease. It was about probing the limits of what the human body could withstand. He subjected patients to experimental treatments involving harsh chemical compounds, injected untested substances directly into their veins, and performed amputations and operations in ways designed not only to treat, but to observe the progression of trauma. To his defenders, he was a man of science ahead of his time. To his detractors, he was little more than a torturer wearing the mask of a physician. The story of the Medical Institute of Horror cannot be separated from the wider context of American medicine in the antebellum era. Across the country, medical practitioners were struggling with the question of professionalism. There were no universally enforced standards, no consistent codes of ethics. The American Medical Association would not be founded until 1847, the very year Sullivan's practices began to draw public scrutiny. That organization sought to bring legitimacy and structure to medicine, but in places like rural Kentucky, physicians still operated with little oversight. Sullivan exploited this lack of accountability. His institute became a place where he could conduct experiments that might not have been tolerated in the larger cities or within established universities. Some accounts suggest that Sullivan attracted medical students and young doctors eager to learn from his daring techniques. He demonstrated dissections and surgical experiments, treating his institute as part clinic, part laboratory, and part theater of anatomy. For students frustrated with the slow pace of traditional study, Sullivan's methods seemed exciting. He promised insights into the workings of the human body that could not be found in textbooks. Yet for the families of his patients, this excitement came at a terrible cost. The most unsettling aspect of Sullivan's legacy lies in the testimonies that trickled out from those who escaped his care or from the families who managed to retrieve their loved ones. These testimonies describe patients being restrained for long periods, subjected to painful procedures without consent, and sometimes left to die after experiments had run their course. One particularly disturbing case involved a young woman suffering from tuberculosis. Instead of treating her with the common methods of the day, rest, diet, and supportive care, Sullivan used her as a subject for experiments on lung punctures, inserting instruments into her chest to test how much damage could be inflicted before death ensued. Her suffering was recounted by one of Sullivan's former assistants, who later expressed deep remorse for participating. There were also whispers of bodies disappearing, of Sullivan selling cadavers to other medical schools for profit. Grave robbing was common, but Sullivan seemed to have found a way to bypass the grave altogether. His patients, once dead, became material for his experiments and for the anatomy trade. This practice fueled outrage in the local community, where traditional respect for the dead clashed violently with Sullivan's cold scientific utilitarianism. By the late 1840s, word of Sullivan's institute spread beyond Kentucky. Newspapers occasionally hinted at irregular practices and questionable experiments, though libel laws and the medical profession's reluctance to expose its own often kept coverage muted. Still, the whispers grew louder. Families who had lost loved ones began to speak out, and local ministers condemned Sullivan's institute from the pulpit, describing it as a house of desecration and cruelty. The nickname Medical Institute of Horror emerged not from Sullivan himself, but from those who viewed his work with outrage and fear. What makes the story so compelling is that it occupies a strange space between legitimate medical history and the macabre. Sullivan was not an outright charlatan like many snake oil salesmen of his day. He had training, skill, and knowledge. Some of his anatomical findings contributed to the growing pool of medical understanding in America, but his willingness to cross ethical lines, to treat human beings as expendable material for research, marked him as something darker. He was both a product of his time and a transgressor of its moral boundaries. The year 1847 was a turning point. Across the nation, medicine was attempting to reform itself, to draw clear lines between quackery and professionalism. The founding of the American Medical Association symbolized this struggle. At the same time, new anesthetics like ether and chloroform were beginning to spread, promising relief from the agony of surgery. Yet in Sullivan's institute, patients still screamed in pain, strapped to tables while he cut and observed. His disregard for these advancements only deepened the sense that he was less interested in healing than in spectacle and control. By the early 1850s, community outrage reached a breaking point. Legal records suggest that investigations were launched, though few concrete charges stuck. Medicine was still a largely unregulated profession, and proving misconduct was difficult without clear standards. Sullivan defended himself as a pioneer misunderstood by the public, a man willing to endure the condemnation of the ignorant in order to advance knowledge. But the stain on his reputation grew darker. Families avoided his institute, and students began to drift away, unwilling to be associated with a figure so mired in scandal. Even so, his story did not simply vanish. In later decades, historians and medical ethicists would point to Sullivan as an example of why oversight and accountability were essential. His work became a grim reminder of how easily the vulnerable could be exploited in the name of progress. The phrase "medical institute of horror," though sensational, captured the essence of what had taken place. A crossing of boundaries so profound that it left scars not only on the victims, but on the reputation of American medicine itself. As the decade of the 1850s began, Dr. Cornelius Sullivan's institute stood as both a place of whispered fear and reluctant fascination. For every family that cursed his name, there were still those who, out of desperation, brought their loved ones to his door. Medicine at the time offered so few effective cures that Sullivan's promises of advanced treatment, however controversial, could still tempt the hopeless. But the tide was shifting. The medical profession, increasingly aware of its fragile public reputation, began to recognize that men like Sullivan threatened the credibility of the field as a whole. The American Medical Association, newly founded in 1847, was quick to issue statements on medical ethics and the need to protect patients from abuse. Although enforcement was weak, the very fact that ethical codes were being drafted signaled a new era. Sullivan found himself at odds with this movement. He dismissed the association as an organization of timid men, too afraid to face the realities of human suffering. To him, science was not advanced by caution, but by boldness, even if that boldness inflicted pain. This attitude, while perhaps appealing to a few younger students seeking notoriety, increasingly alienated him from the mainstream. The stories circulating in Kentucky grew darker. Locals told of wagons arriving late at night, delivering bodies whose origins were unclear. Some believed Sullivan had struck deals with grave robbers, while others whispered that not all of the bodies came from cemeteries. Farm families reported missing relatives, those who had gone to Sullivan's institute seeking care, but were never seen again. Such claims were difficult to prove, and in a time when death was a constant visitor, the line between rumor and reality was easily blurred. Still, the sense of dread surrounding the institute only deepened. Accounts from former assistants provide some of the clearest windows into what took place behind closed doors. One assistant, years later, described an operation in which Sullivan attempted to transplant tissue from a deceased patient into a living one, a procedure doomed to failure but carried out with relentless determination. The patient died within days, but Sullivan reportedly recorded the process in meticulous detail, noting how the body rejected the graft. In another case, he experimented with chemical compounds intended to treat infection, injecting caustic substances directly into open wounds. The results were predictably disastrous, leading to gangrene and death. To Sullivan, these failures were not tragedies but data points. He catalogued them, convinced that he was building a foundation of knowledge that future generations would appreciate. This mindset reveals the paradox of Sullivan's legacy. On one hand, he shared the spirit of inquiry that defined much of 19th century science. Medicine advanced only because individuals dared to test new ideas, often at great personal risk. On the other hand, Sullivan's indifference to consent and suffering placed him outside the bounds of what society was willing to tolerate. His refusal to see patients as more than experimental material stripped away the humanity at the core of medicine. In this sense, he became less a pioneer and more a warning of how science could be twisted when ethical restraints were ignored. By the mid-1850s, Kentucky itself was experiencing political and social upheaval. The tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War were beginning to simmer, with debates over slavery, states' rights, and economic development dominating public life. In such an atmosphere, communities were especially sensitive to any figure who seemed to threaten moral order. Ministers began to preach directly against Sullivan, warning congregations that his institute represented not just medical danger, but spiritual corruption. The body, they insisted, was sacred, and to desecrate it in pursuit of knowledge was to invite divine judgment. Legal authorities began to take notice as well. Court records from the era are fragmentary, but there are indications that Sullivan faced inquiries into his practices. Families testified about relatives who had entered the institute alive and left only as corpses. Some accused him of performing dissections before death had even occurred, a charge that, if true, would have placed him among the most ruthless of practitioners. Yet the lack of consistent medical regulations made prosecution difficult. Without clear standards, it was nearly impossible to prove that his experiments were outside the law. He remained, in a sense, untouchable, feared, despised, but beyond the reach of justice. Nevertheless, the pressure mounted. Fewer students sought out his instruction, wary of tarnishing their reputations. Other physicians in the region distanced themselves, some denouncing him outright, others simply refusing to speak his name. The once modest stream of patients began to dry up as word of his methods spread from town to town. For Sullivan, this isolation only seemed to fuel a deeper obsession. Deprived of external validation, he withdrew further into his work, conducting experiments in secrecy, with only a handful of loyal assistants to aid him. It was during this period that some of the most disturbing accounts emerge. Reports suggest that Sullivan began experimenting on prisoners and indigent populations, those who had little power to refuse or resist. In a society where the poor, enslaved and marginalized were often denied basic rights, such exploitation was tragically common. Sullivan, however, took this exploitation to extremes, subjecting individuals to prolonged experiments that offered no hope of benefit. In one instance, he allegedly induced fevers in healthy subjects by deliberately infecting them with malaria, seeking to study the progression of the disease. In another, he exposed patients to toxic gases, recording their convulsions and final moments with clinical detachment. What drove him to such extremes remains a matter of speculation. Some contemporaries suggested that Sullivan was motivated purely by scientific curiosity, a relentless drive to uncover truths about the human body. Others believed his actions revealed a darker psychological profile, one marked by cruelty and a lack of empathy. Modern historians, examining the scant evidence, often conclude that he embodied both tendencies. A man of genuine intelligence and ambition, but devoid of the ethical compass necessary to direct those qualities toward humane ends. By the late 1850s, the community's patience had run out. Stories of missing bodies combined with the increasing boldness of his experiments led to a crisis of public trust. In one notorious incident, townspeople reportedly gathered outside the institute, demanding that it be shut down. The confrontation did not lead to immediate closure, but it underscored the depth of local anger. Newspapers, once hesitant to criticize him directly, began to publish more pointed accounts, referring to his work as ghastly and his institute as a chamber of cruelty. The moniker Medical Institute of Horror, first whispered in private circles, now appeared in print. Yet even as his reputation collapsed, Sullivan continued to defend himself. In letters that survived from the period, he argued that all great scientific advances had been met with misunderstanding and hostility. He compared himself to figures like Galileo, claiming that society punished those who dared to challenge accepted truths. He predicted that in time his work would be vindicated and that future generations would look back on his experiments as necessary steps toward progress. Whether he truly believed this or whether it was a desperate attempt to justify his actions is unclear. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 further complicated Sullivan's story. Kentucky, a border state divided between Union and Confederate loyalties, became a site of chaos, violence, and suffering. For physicians, the war created new opportunities for medical experimentation as battlefield injuries forced innovations in surgery and care. Some speculate that Sullivan attempted to align himself with military medicine, offering his services to study wounds and amputations. However, records of his involvement are sparse, and it is possible that by this time his reputation was too tainted for either side to fully embrace him. The war years also shifted public attention away from local scandals. With thousands dying on battlefields and in hospitals, the horrors of Sullivan's Institute seemed almost small in comparison. Yet for those who remembered, the war only confirmed their fears. If medicine could become so brutal under the pressures of conflict, what did it say about a man who had embraced such brutality in times of peace? For many, Sullivan came to symbolize the dangers of unchecked power in the hands of physicians. By the end of the 1860s, the institute was in decline. Reports suggest that it was largely abandoned, its once busy halls now quiet, its reputation irreparably destroyed. Sullivan himself fades from the record after this period. Some accounts claim he died in obscurity, continuing his experiments until the very end. Others suggest he left Kentucky altogether, seeking anonymity in another state. Whatever the truth, his name lived on in local memory, carried in whispered warnings and cautionary tales told to young doctors and medical students. The legacy of the Medical Institute of Horror outlived its founder. In the decades that followed, as American medicine grew more professional and regulated, Sullivan's story was cited as an example of why oversight was necessary. The rise of medical ethics as a formal discipline owed much to the recognition that without clear boundaries, science could be twisted into cruelty. Sullivan, though perhaps not the only physician guilty of such practices, became a symbol of the darkest possibilities within medicine. As the years passed, the once feared Medical Institute of Horror stood as a husk of its former notoriety. By the 1870s, the building itself was said to be falling into disrepair, its walls weathered, windows broken and hallways silent, except for the occasional wanderer who dared to step inside. What had once been filled with the cries of patients and the cold efficiency of experiments was now abandoned, a relic of a darker era. Locals avoided the site, some out of lingering fear, others out of disgust. The structure itself became a physical reminder of the uneasy marriage between science and suffering, a warning etched in wood and stone. Sullivan's fate remains a matter of speculation, for the historical record grows thin. Some believed he died in Kentucky, buried quietly without ceremony, his grave unmarked to prevent desecration by those who despised him. Others told stories that he fled the state, moving south or perhaps even overseas to escape his ruined reputation. There are even accounts that place him in New Orleans during the yellow fever epidemics of the 1870s, practicing medicine under another name. Whether these stories hold truth or not, what mattered most was not Sullivan's personal end, but the impact of his work on those who followed. In the years after the Civil War, American medicine entered a period of transformation. The carnage of the battlefield had accelerated surgical knowledge, teaching physicians how to amputate more efficiently, how to manage shock, and how to cope with infection. Yet at the same time, the war had also exposed the brutality that could occur when human life was reduced to a problem of logistics. In this context, the memory of Sullivan's Institute served as a potent warning. Physicians and reformers began to emphasize the importance of compassion, consent, and ethical boundaries in the practice of medicine. What had once been considered matters of personal conscience were now increasingly codified into professional standards. The 1870s and 1880s saw the rise of stricter medical licensing laws in many states. Medical schools began to adopt standardized curricula, and professional associations demanded accountability from their members. The case of Sullivan, though often recounted in hushed tones, provided a cautionary tale that reformers could point to when arguing for change. They could say, if men like Sullivan are allowed to practice unchecked, medicine itself becomes a threat rather than a blessing. His story, then, helped to shape the push toward oversight and regulation. At the same time, historians of the era wrestled with how to categorize Sullivan. Was he merely a rogue physician, an outlier who exploited the chaos of the antebellum period? Or was he symptomatic of broader tendencies within 19th century medicine, where experimentation too often blurred into exploitation? Scholars today tend to see him as both, a man whose extremism made him infamous, but whose practices reflected real tensions within his profession. The hunger for knowledge, the lack of ethical guidelines, and the vulnerability of patients in desperate circumstances. All of these forces combined to create the conditions in which someone like Sullivan could thrive. The legacy of the Medical Institute of Horror also had cultural consequences. In Kentucky, the story passed into local folklore, told in ways that emphasized its moral lessons. Parents warned their children about wandering too close to the abandoned building, while preachers used Sullivan as an example of how human pride could lead to damnation. In popular imagination, he became less a physician and more a symbol of hubris, a man who thought he could play God and was punished for it. Though details were often exaggerated or distorted, the core of the story remained. That unchecked ambition could turn healing into horror. By the turn of the 20th century, medicine had advanced dramatically. Germ theory had revolutionized the understanding of disease. Antiseptic practices had reduced the risk of infection. And new technologies like the stethoscope and the microscope gave doctors unprecedented tools. In this new scientific age, the figure of Sullivan seemed both archaic and chillingly modern. Archaic because his crude experiments looked primitive compared to laboratory-based research, but modern because the ethical dilemmas he embodied had not disappeared. The question of how far science should go, and at what cost, remained as relevant as ever. Indeed, when debates emerged in the 20th century about medical experimentation on prisoners, the poor or marginalized communities, echoes of Sullivan's Institute could be heard. The abuses that came to light in later cases, such as the Tuskegee syphilis study or the use of unconsenting patients in psychiatric hospitals, resonated with the same themes of exploitation and rationalization. In this sense, Sullivan's story was not merely a local curiosity, but part of a longer and broader history of medical ethics. What makes Sullivan's case particularly unsettling is that he was not a quack in the usual sense. He did not peddle patent medicines or claim supernatural cures. He was a trained physician who believed in science, but whose vision of science was stripped of humanity. This made his institute far more disturbing than the traveling charlatans of his era. For those who later studied his work, the lesson was clear. Scientific training alone is not enough to ensure ethical practice. Without a moral framework, knowledge can become a weapon rather than a tool for healing. The ruins of the Institute by the early 1900s had mostly vanished. Some say the building was torn down, its wood repurposed for barns and fences. Others insist it was simply left to collapse, the land reclaimed by weeds and trees. Whatever its physical fate, the memory of what happened there lingered. Even in the absence of walls, the story endured, carried by oral tradition, by fragments of newspaper reports, and by the occasional reference in medical journals discussing the need for ethical reform. Looking back, it is easy to ask how such a figure was allowed to operate for so long. Part of the answer lies in the fragmented state of medicine in the mid-19th century, when professional standards were weak and local communities lacked the power to challenge trained physicians. Part lies in the desperation of patients and families who, facing death, were willing to try anything, even if it meant submitting to dangerous experiments. And part lies in the human tendency to look away, to avoid confronting horrors too directly, especially when they are cloaked in the language of science and progress. Sullivan's story reminds us that progress in medicine has always come at a price. The lives lost in his institute cannot be redeemed by the knowledge he may have gained, but their suffering forced future generations to ask hard questions about what medicine should be. Out of their pain came a clearer recognition that healing is not only a matter of technical skill, but of compassion, respect, and humanity. Without these, medicine risks becoming a form of cruelty disguised as care. By the mid-20th century, when medical ethics had become an established field, Sullivan's name occasionally resurfaced in discussions of historical abuses. He was invoked as an early American example of the dangers of unregulated experimentation, a reminder that the impulse to push boundaries can easily slide into atrocity if not restrained. In this way, his legacy shaped not only Kentucky's memory, but the broader understanding of medical history in the United States. For all of this, Sullivan remains a shadowy figure. Much about his life is uncertain, and many of the stories told about him may have been colored by exaggeration or myth. Yet the persistence of those stories suggests that they touched on a deeper truth, one that resonated across generations. Whether every detail was accurate or not, the essence of the tale, the transformation of medicine into horror when ethics are abandoned, was too powerful to forget. In reflecting on Sullivan's Institute, we are forced to confront uncomfortable questions. How do we balance the pursuit of knowledge with the protection of human dignity? How do we ensure that desperation does not make people vulnerable to exploitation? How do we prevent ambitious individuals from convincing themselves that cruelty is justified by future benefits? These questions were not only relevant in the 19th century, they remain vital today. Advances in genetics, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence raise similar dilemmas, where the promise of progress must always be weighed against the risk of dehumanization. The story of the Medical Institute of Horror, then, is not simply a historical curiosity, but a mirror held up to medicine across time. It reflects the dangers of arrogance, the consequences of neglecting ethics, and the resilience of communities that, even in the face of power, demand accountability. It is a story that warns us never to separate science from humanity, for when we do, we risk repeating the same mistakes that left scars on Kentucky in 1847. By the late 19th century, as America entered the age of industrialization and modern science, the shadow of Cornelius Sullivan and his institute still loomed in Kentucky's memory. Though his building no longer stood in any official capacity, and though his personal fate was uncertain, the story of what had happened there refused to disappear. Communities carried it forward not merely as a tale of horror, but as a warning of what could happen when medicine lost sight of its purpose. In this way, Sullivan became less a man and more a parable, a reminder of how ambition, unchecked, can corrode the very foundations of healing. The oral histories that circulated among Kentucky families often softened or dramatized details depending on the audience. Children heard warnings not to wander near the grounds, framed almost like ghost stories, while adults spoke of the institute in tones of moral outrage, emphasizing its lessons about pride, cruelty, and misplaced faith in authority. Even if much of the detail blurred with time, the emotional truth remained. Sullivan had turned the promise of medicine into something terrifying. For families who had lost loved ones within those walls, no amount of progress in later decades could erase the memory of suffering. The professional medical community, meanwhile, moved to distance itself from such associations. By the 1880s and 1890s, American physicians were striving to elevate their profession, drawing more heavily on European models of scientific medicine, particularly those emerging from Germany and France. Laboratories, peer-reviewed journals, and licensing boards all became more central to medical practice. Against this backdrop, figures like Sullivan were cast as cautionary examples of what American medicine had once been, before it reformed itself into a profession of rigor and respectability. For medical educators, the tale of Sullivan served as an illustration of why ethical codes mattered, why oversight mattered, and why physicians needed to be held to standards higher than mere curiosity or ambition. Yet the question remained, had Sullivan truly been an aberration, or had he simply been more brazen than others? This question continues to shape historical discussions even today. The 19th century was filled with examples of physicians experimenting on the poor, the enslaved, and the institutionalized. Some of these men are still remembered as pioneers, their abuses glossed over in accounts of scientific progress. Sullivan, however, was remembered differently. His reputation too dark, his practices too notorious to be rehabilitated. In this sense, his story helps us confront the uncomfortable truth that the line between progress and exploitation has always been thin, and that society's judgment of who crosses it often depends as much on public perception as on the actual harm inflicted. One of the most striking aspects of Sullivan's legacy is how it was framed by those who survived him. For the local communities of Kentucky, his institute symbolized betrayal. The betrayal of trust that patients place in doctors, the betrayal of families who believed their loved ones would be healed, and the betrayal of the very promise of medicine itself. For reformers, it symbolized the need for vigilance. If one man could cause so much suffering under the guise of science, then no physician should ever be left without accountability again. For later generations, the story offered a way to reflect on the dangers of blind faith in progress, reminding them that advances in knowledge are not automatically advances in humanity. By the dawn of the 20th century, American medicine was entering a new phase of confidence. The discoveries of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch had established germ theory beyond doubt, and new vaccines and antiseptics were saving lives. Surgeons, once feared for the agony they inflicted, now worked in operating theaters equipped with anesthesia and sterilized instruments. Hospitals became centers of healing rather than places of last resort. Yet even in this new age, the memory of Sullivan retained its potency. It was invoked when medical students studied the ethics of human experimentation, when communities debated the rights of patients, and when physicians considered the dangers of ambition unchecked by compassion. The parallels to later abuses are impossible to ignore. In the 20th century, as science advanced further, new scandals emerged. Unconsenting patients in psychiatric asylums, prisoners subjected to chemical tests, and poor communities exploited in the name of research. Each time such abuses came to light, historians and ethicists could point back to earlier examples, Sullivan among them, to show that these were not new problems, but enduring ones. The central question, how to pursue knowledge without sacrificing humanity, was one that each generation had to grapple with anew. For Kentucky itself, the story became part of a darker heritage, one intertwined with the broader struggles of the 19th century. The state, caught between North and South, between tradition and modernity, had seen its share of violence and upheaval. The Institute fit into this landscape as a kind of microcosm of the era's contradictions. The promise of progress tainted by exploitation, the language of science masking cruelty, and the thin line between healing and harm. To this day, when historians recount the history of medicine in Kentucky, the name Cornelius Sullivan is likely to appear as a reminder of the complexities of that past. What lessons, then, can we draw from his story? Perhaps the most obvious is that knowledge without ethics is dangerous. Sullivan was intelligent, even skilled, but his intelligence was directed toward experiments that disregarded the value of human life. His story shows that technical ability is never enough, that the moral framework guiding its use is what determines whether it serves humanity or harms it. Another lesson is that communities play a vital role in holding medicine accountable. It was the voices of families, ministers, and ordinary citizens that eventually forced Sullivan's Institute into decline, even when legal and professional systems failed to act. Their outrage, their refusal to remain silent, demonstrated the power of collective conscience against the authority of a physician who had lost his way. Finally, Sullivan's story reminds us of the resilience of memory. Though his building crumbled and his personal fate grew obscure, the story endured. It endured because it touched on universal fears, the fear of betrayal by those meant to protect us, the fear of suffering disguised as healing, the fear of progress divorced from morality. These fears ensured that Sullivan's name would not simply vanish into the past, but would continue to haunt discussions of medicine, ethics, and human dignity. Today, when we look back on the year 1847 in Kentucky and the rise of the Medical Institute of Horror, we see more than just a local scandal. We see a moment in history that encapsulates the perils of ambition unchecked by ethics. We see how easily desperation can lead people to trust in dangerous promises. We see how science without humanity can become indistinguishable from cruelty. And we see how the lessons of the past remain urgent for the present. For every advance we celebrate today, in genetics, biotechnology, or artificial intelligence, we must also ask, are we protecting the dignity of those most vulnerable? Are we remembering that progress is only meaningful if it serves humanity rather than sacrificing it? The story of Dr. Cornelius Sullivan, grim as it is, offers no easy answers. It offers instead a stark reminder. Medicine is not merely a science of bodies, but a covenant with people. Break that covenant, and even the most brilliant discoveries are tainted. Honor it, and medicine becomes what it was always meant to be, a force for healing, compassion, and life. In the end, this is the enduring lesson of the Medical Institute of Horror, that the true horror was not in the diseases, the surgeries, or the deaths, but in the moment when a physician forgot that every patient is more than a subject, they are a human being. And if you found this journey into the forgotten past as thought-provoking and unsettling as I did, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories of haunted history, forgotten horrors, and mysteries the world tried to bury. Don't forget to like this video if it kept you hooked. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on Dr. Sullivan's story, and share it with anyone who loves diving into the darker corners of history. Your support keeps these stories alive and ensures the voices of the past are never silenced.